On the 25th of August, 1932, in a bedroom at the Drake Hotel in Chicago, a woman was dying of cancer. She was 60 years old. The room was comfortable, impersonal, rented, a commercial suite on Michigan Avenue, the sounds of traffic rising from the street below. On the nightstand, nothing that identified her. On the walls, nothing she had chosen. She had once owned a 44-room palazzo above Lake Michigan, with terraced gardens and a private beach and a hangar for her husband's airplane. She was not dying there. She was dying here, in a room that would be cleaned and occupied by a stranger within the week. Around the bed, for the first time in 11 years, sat the people who had once made up her household, the former husband and the three surviving children of a marriage that had joined two of the most powerful family names in America. They had not gathered by choice. They had gathered because death does not accept delegation. It cannot be handled by a committee or administered through a trust. You have to be in the room. The woman in that bed was Edith Rockefeller McCormick, daughter of the wealthiest man in the country, wife of a Chicago industrial heir, patron of opera and science and cities. The world had watched her for decades, the philanthropy, the splendor, the scandal, the strange late years. What the world had not seen was what happened to the children. This is that story. 5 children born inside a fortune so vast it operated like a system. 2 dead before their 4th birthdays. 3 who survived and discovered that the wealth their family had built was not protection, it was machinery. And the machinery did not stop when their mother's breathing did. That moment at the Drake Hotel, the former husband, the 3 surviving children, the borrowed intimacy of a commercial suite standing in for the palaces this family once inhabited, was not the beginning. It was the end of something that had been building for more than 3 decades across 2 of the most powerful American fortunes ever assembled, through the lives of 5 children and the deaths of 2 of them, through a marriage that joined dynasties and a divorce that scattered the remnants across 2 continents. This is the story of what happened inside the household of Edith Rockefeller McCormick and Harold Fowler McCormick. It is the story of 5 children born into wealth so vast that it operated like weather, inescapable, atmospheric, shaping everything it touched. And of the 3 who survived childhood, only to discover that the fortune their family had built was not a gift. It was a machine, and machines do not love the people who live inside them. To understand how that family ended in a hotel bedroom with nothing left to repair, you have to go back. Back to the money, back to the iron and the oil, back to the 2 names that, when joined on a November afternoon in 1895, created something that looked like American royalty and felt, for the people living inside it, like a system with no exit. The name Rockefeller, by the early 20th century, had become something more than a surname. It was shorthand for a particular kind of American power, the power that came not from land or title or inherited position, but from the ruthless organization of an industry so vast that even the federal government had struggled to contain it. John D. Rockefeller Sr., born in Richford, New York in 1839, had built Standard Oil into the most formidable petroleum empire the world had yet seen, and in doing so had become, by most reckonings, the wealthiest private citizen in the United States. PBS would later describe him simply as the head of the most powerful family in America, and that description, however blunt, was not exaggeration. His name appeared in newspapers as both a marvel and an accusation. He was the founder of modern philanthropy and the symbol of monopolist excess. He was Sunday school piety and corporate ruthlessness, stitched into the same thin, careful frame. He donated with one hand and crushed competitors with the other, and the world that formed around him, the trusts, the foundations, the committees, the carefully managed public face of generosity, was a world built not on sentiment, but on control. What mattered most for this story was not the fortune itself. It was the method behind it. Rockefeller did not merely accumulate. He organized. He built systems of oversight, trusts, holding companies, family committees, hierarchies of approval that were designed to outlast any individual decision, any moment of weakness, any impulse that might threaten the architecture of the whole. His children were raised on strict allowances. His household ran on moral seriousness, Baptist propriety, and a species of thrift that must have seemed bizarre inside one of the wealthiest homes in the country. Money, in the Rockefeller Code, was not there to be enjoyed. It was there to be managed. And management meant structure, the right trust instrument, the right committee, the right legal framework to ensure that no one person's feeling could undo what the system had built. That instinct and the deep conviction that control could solve anything would become the most consequential thing John D. Rockefeller Sr., ever passed to his descendants not the oil, not the billions. The belief that if you designed the structure well enough, it would hold even when the people inside it were falling apart. It would not. But the family would spend decades discovering that. On the other side of this marriage stood the McCormicks of Chicago. If Rockefeller represented Eastern finance and petroleum, the McCormicks represented the industrial Midwest at its most physically formidable: machinery, agriculture, the transformation of the American landscape from frontier into factory. Cyrus Hall McCormick, credited by encyclopedists with the development of the mechanical reaper, had created the invention that made large-scale grain harvesting possible and radically lowered the labor cost of feeding a growing nation. The fortune that followed consolidated into International Harvester, one of the largest and most powerful manufacturing enterprises of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The McCormick name meant something different from Rockefeller. It meant Chicago, it meant production, it meant iron and wheat and the prairie converted into profit. But it meant something equally immovable. This was a family whose identity was welded to the machines that bore their name, and whose sense of duty was industrial as much as it was personal. To be a McCormick was to be expected to serve the company. To carry the name was to carry the obligation. There was no separating private life from public role, because the company was the family and the family was the company, and the fortunes of both were understood as a single, continuous enterprise that no individual desire should be permitted to interrupt. Harold Fowler McCormick, born in Chicago on the 2nd of May, 1872, was the son of Cyrus and Nettie Fowler McCormick, and he had grown up inside that expectation. From his first conscious breath, he joined the family business young. He spent his adult life near the top of International Harvester. He was not a drifter, not a second son looking for a wealthy bride to fund his leisure, not a man who needed the Rockefeller connection to make his name. He was already the heir of a dynasty. That mattered enormously, because when he married Edith Rockefeller, the union was not her escape from one controlling system into something lighter or freer. It was an intensification. She moved from Rockefeller discipline to McCormick obligation. And the household they built together would carry the emotional weight of both empires: the Eastern oil fortune's insistence on structure and the Midwestern industrial family's insistence on duty, without any of the lightness that ordinary domestic life might have provided as relief. These were not merely successful families. They were system builders, people who had constructed enterprises that ran on discipline, efficiency, hierarchy, and long-range control, and who had, in the process, remade the physical and economic landscape of America. Standard Oil's rise and eventual breakup by federal antitrust action, the consolidation of industrial capitalism in the Midwest, the progressive era's uneasy accommodation with plutocratic power, all of this was the air the McCormick-Rockefeller household would breathe. Edith and Harold were not merely rich people in a vacuum. They were rich people living through the precise historical moment when American wealth was trying to convert itself from scandal into legitimacy, from robber baron excess into philanthropy, culture, and public respectability. Their children would inherit not only the money but the pressure to justify it, to prove that the family name now meant something finer than the monopoly and the machine that had created it. Their marriage, on the 26th of November, 1895, was treated by the press as something close to a coronation. Two of America's greatest fortunes joined by a union that contemporaries viewed with the kind of awe reserved for the merging of royal houses. There was no crown here, no formal peerage, no hereditary title to bestow. But there was an American equivalent, the entwining of oil and industry, of New York finance and Chicago society, of philanthropic boards and cultural institutions, and the machinery of prestige that the Gilded Age had constructed to give its plutocrats the appearance of permanence. What nobody said, because nobody in 1895 could have known, was that the two systems being merged were not complementary, they were compressive. Rockefeller control plus McCormick duty did not add up to a household, it added up to a regime. Edith and Harold did not begin their married life inside that regime's fullest expression. They spent their first 2 years in Council Bluffs, Iowa, where Harold managed a branch of the business. That period reads, in retrospect, as the last time this marriage existed at a human scale, a young couple in a Midwestern city, away from the families, away from the boards and the trustees and the expectations, living something that might have resembled ordinary life. Then they returned to Chicago, then to Lakeshore Drive, to the city residence at number 1000, designed by the architect Solon S. Beeman. And then, between 1908 and 1912, they built Villa Turicum, and modesty was finished. Villa Turicum is essential to this story because it literalizes the family's deepest problem: the belief that if you build something magnificent enough, what happens inside it will be magnificent too. The estate sat on a 300-acre plateau above Lake Michigan in Lake Forest, Illinois. The architect was Charles Platt, chosen after Edith and Harold reportedly considered and rejected Frank Lloyd Wright in favor of something grander and more traditionally imposing. Platt designed an Italianate palazzo of 44 rooms, set at the end of a long formal mall lined with American elms. The grounds descended toward the lake through layered terraces, fountains, and gardens modeled, in part after the Renaissance water gardens of Villa Lante. There was a tea house set into the woodland. There was a bathhouse near the shore. There was a private beach, and later a hangar for Harold's airplane. There were watercourses and garden paths winding through hundreds of acres of maintained landscape. The cost was staggering even by the standards of American plutocratic display. Roughly $2 million for the land alone, and another $5 million for construction, sums that in the currency of their time signaled not comfort but civilization itself. The Lake Forest Lake Bluff History Museum would later call it perhaps the best known of Lake Forest's country estates, and that assessment captured both its grandeur and its fragility. The house was designed to last centuries. It was designed to project solidity, continuity, rootedness, a family embedded in the American landscape as firmly as any English country house in the soil of its county. It would be demolished in 1956 after years of dormancy and vandalism because nobody was left who could or would inhabit what it represented. There is something about Villa Turicum that is worth sitting with for a moment before the story moves forward. Families who feel secure do not always need to construct meaning with such intensity. Families who are certain of their own permanence do not always build 44-room palaces with formal water gardens and wooded terraces descending toward a private beach. The architecture of Villa Turicum was not merely the expression of wealth. It was the attempt to manufacture completeness, to build in stone and elm and imported Italian garden design, the emotional stability that the household inside those walls could not generate on its own. The house was already compensating for something that had not yet fully broken, but had never been quite whole. The financial scale of the family should be stated concretely but carefully. Edith alone was associated in the press with a personal fortune once estimated at roughly $40 million. Later inventories, taken after her death, would reveal how much of that supposed wealth had become entangled in real estate, furnishings, trust structures, and debt rather than existing as simple liquid freedom. By 1932, newspapers were describing a woman whose estate had been badly damaged by borrowing and by the post-1929 collapse. The outline of her finances traces one of the story's subtlest threads: the distinction between the appearance of limitless money and the reality of controlled, diminishing, legally contested money. That distinction would define her children's lives. The values at the center of this household were contradictory from the start, and those contradictions are the seeds of everything that followed. Edith Rockefeller McCormick was born in Cleveland on the 31st of August, 1872. The fourth daughter of John D. Rockefeller and Laura Spelman Rockefeller. She was raised in one of the richest households in America and also one of the most tightly governed. Later accounts of her life repeatedly stressed a gendered imbalance inside that childhood home. The youngest child, John D. Rockefeller Jr., born in 1874, was the only son, and he received the weight of expectation and the privilege of centrality that his four older sisters could observe clearly and resent quietly. The generational seed matters more than it might first appear. The children of Edith's own marriage would grow up inside a family where wealth was not neutral. It had a structure, and that structure had favorites. Edith understood from an early age what it meant to be a daughter inside a system built for a son. She would spend her adult life resisting the implications of that understanding, and the resistance would cost her nearly everything she had. Publicly, Edith became the queen of Chicago society. Patron of the opera, benefactor of the Art Institute, supporter of juvenile probation, donor of the land that would become Brookfield Zoo. She was formidable, cultured, genuinely ambitious, and unwilling to stay within the smallest available definition of a wealthy daughter or a corporate wife. Privately, she was in repeated conflict with her father, who despised her extravagance, disapproved of her increasingly unconventional philanthropies, and resented the way she spent. She was documented as suffering from depression. She was drawn, especially after 1913, toward Zurich, toward Carl Jung, toward psychoanalysis, and eventually toward the practice of Jungian analysis herself. She developed interest in reincarnation and past life connection that placed her ever further from the world her father and husband inhabited. And she left. That is the fact that must be stated plainly, because it shaped everything that happened to the children. In 1913, Edith went to Zurich for treatment and study, and she stayed for years. She did not vanish from their lives entirely. There were visits, letters, the maintenance of connection at a distance. But presence and connection are not the same thing, and what the children experienced was the sustained absence of a mother who was, by all accounts, brilliant, but elsewhere. A mother can be intellectually pioneering and emotionally absent at the same time. And the history of women of means who sought self-realization at the cost of domestic continuity is not a simple one. Edith was not merely escaping, she was searching. But her children could not be expected to understand the difference. And the household they were left inside, Harold's household, the household of business routine and social expectation and paternal order, was not a warm one. It was an administered one. The nurseries were staffed. The routines were maintained. The appearance of family life continued. What was missing was the particular chaos and warmth that a present mother, even an imperfect one, provides. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. Harold, meanwhile, remained in Chicago, anchored to business, to international harvester, to the outward continuity of the family name. He was Edith's opposite in almost every way that mattered for the survival of a marriage. Where she was restless, he was steady. Where she sought meaning in the esoteric, he sought it in the boardroom, the country club, the machinery of business hierarchy. He was handsome, publicly charming, active in aviation and the arts, a man of genuine social ease who could finance grand cultural gestures and host with impeccable form. He was also, beneath the polish, profoundly conventional. He could underwrite glamour. He could not absorb disorder. And when the marriage fractured, Harold was the parent who secured the institutional advantage in custody arrangements, guardianship appointments, the backing of trustees and committees, not because he was vindictive, but because he was orderly, and the system was built to reward order. He embodied the truth that patriarchal power can appear polished, reasonable, and even generous while remaining devastating in its effects. He did not need to raise his voice. He had lawyers. Their first child, John Rockefeller McCormick, was born in 1897. He would be dead before his 4th birthday of scarlet fever at Kikwit, the Rockefeller estate at Pocantico Hills, one of the most protected environments in America. That fact must not be treated as a footnote. John's death in 1901 was the first proof that this family's wealth could not purchase immunity from the ordinary brutalities of human life. A 3-year-old boy dead in his grandfather's mansion, despite every advantage the most powerful family in the country could provide. The McCormicks responded by founding the John McCormick Institute for Infectious Diseases. That response was moving and sincere. It was also the family code made visible. Grief translated into institution, loss converted into memorial fund, sorrow processed not as emotion, but as organization. When something broke in this family, the instinct was not to sit with the pain. It was to build around it, and the pattern would repeat with every subsequent crisis, growing more rigid and more inadequate each time. The second child to die was Edith, born in 1903 and dead in infancy by 1904. Less documented than John, but structurally significant because her death meant that by the time the youngest surviving child, Matilda, was born in 1905, the household was already shaped by 2 absences. The family had buried 2 children before the survivors were old enough to form stable memories. The atmosphere inside those magnificent rooms was therefore shadowed long before the divorce, long before the scandal, long before the trust wars. The surviving children grew up inside beauty and grief simultaneously, and neither was ever fully acknowledged. Harold Fowler, McCormick Jr., known as Fowler, was born on the 15th of November, 1898, and he carried the heaviest burden of all, surviving male heir in a dynasty that understood inheritance as continuation. He would later become president of International Harvester from 1941 to 1946 and chairman from 1946 to 1951. He married Anne Urquhart Potter Stillman, known as Fifi, a woman significantly older, already wealthy, already socially famous from a spectacular previous marriage to James A. Stillman. Fowler's public career looked like success. His private life followed a pattern that was not his alone. He was the child who could function in the public role the dynasty required, which made him useful to the family in a way that neither of his sisters could be. But usefulness to a dynasty is not the same thing as freedom. In the later story, Fowler becomes not merely a son, but an enforcer of family order, particularly in relation to Muriel. And his trajectory reveals the particular burden of the child who is chosen to carry the name forward. He pays for that privilege with any possibility of private rebellion. Muriel McCormick, born in 1903, was the quietest of the surviving children and in many ways the most haunted. Where Fowler could be placed inside the dynasty's public role and Matilda blazed through scandal, Muriel drifted into a life that the historical record captures not through headlines but through litigation. She married Elisha Dyer Hubbard, connected to an old Rhode Island political family and considerably older than she was, and another version of the same pattern, another attachment to a preformed world rather than the building of an independent one. After Hubbard's death in 1936, Muriel's existence became increasingly legible only through court documents. By the late 1940s, she and Fowler were in open conflict over custody involving her adopted children. And after Muriel's own death on the 18th of March, 1959, a California appellate court was left to determine whether those adopted children counted as issue under the instruments governing a trust of roughly $10 million. The competing claims of charities and adopted children had to be adjudicated by strangers because the family could not settle them privately. Even motherhood, for Muriel, became something the fortune could contest. She is perhaps the clearest illustration of what this family's machinery did to its least spectacular members. It did not destroy them through scandal. It processed them through administration until there was nothing left that had not been translated into legal language. And then there was Matilda, born on the 8th of April, 1905, the youngest, the one whose story would explode most visibly into public scandal. As a teenager, she fell in love with Max Ozer, a Swiss writing instructor 28 years her senior. The family divided. Harold sought legal control over her future. The international press turned the romance into spectacle. And in April 1923, at 18 years old, Matilda married Ozer in London, listed in the registry as a spinster of independent means, a phrase that was devastatingly precise. She had means. She did not have independence. She would never fully have it. Matilda died in California on the 18th of May, 1947. She was 42 years old. There is a detail noted in a scholarly review of Andrea Friederici Ross's biography of Edith that deserves its own moment of silence in this narrative. All three surviving children, Fowler, Muriel, and Matilda, married significantly older spouses. That is not coincidence. It is not random social color. It is a pattern so precise, it demands interpretation, and what it suggests about the inner world of these children is more eloquent than any archive could be. Children raised inside system of extraordinary control, administered rather than loved, watched over by trustees and committees rather than held by parents who were fully present. Those children, when they reach for a partner, do not always reach for a peer. They reach for authority. They reach for someone already formed, already settled, already in possession of the certainty that was never available inside their own household. Every surviving McCormick child did exactly that. And every one of them paid for it, in marriages that replicated the imbalance they had grown up inside. One partner with more power, more formation, more of the world already settled, and the other still searching for something that no marriage, however lavish, can provide when the original household withheld it. It is the sort of pattern viewers remember because it feels too precise to be coincidence. It is too precise. The remaining figures who shaped this family's trajectory must be marked here because they will recur. Edwin D. Kren, architect and intimate associate of Edith, who would appear in her will as the beneficiary of 5/12 of her personal estate, a larger share than any individual child received. His name in that document was not a curiosity. It was a detonation. John D. Rockefeller Jr., Edith's younger brother, who appears in the later story not as a warm, familial presence, but as the chairman of the committee that supervised the children's trust income, the family elder who was also inescapably the mechanism. And Max Ozer, the Swiss writing instructor whose marriage to Mathilde became the symbol of how little control even the most powerful families possess over desire once the system begins cracking. The early years of the household, before the fractures became visible, must feel real if the later devastation is to carry any weight. And they were real. The family unit in its first decade was almost indecently photogenic. Edith and Harold in Council Bluffs, then Chicago, then Lakeshore Drive, then Villa Turicum rising on the bluff, the gardens taking shape, Harold's aeroplane on the beach, the opera patronage flowering, the children arriving in their nurseries. It looked to the public like the most successful marriage in America. 2 fortunes, 5 children, a palazzo above the lake, a city that treated them as its first family. And there were genuinely good years inside that image. The account suggests real enthusiasm, real ambition, real pleasure in the scale of what they were building together. Edith's civic energy was prodigious. Harold's public spirit was genuine. The children had nurses, tutors, gardens, and a private beach that stretched toward the lake. The world they inhabited was beautiful. Whether it was warm is another question. The public life during these years was extraordinary, even by the standards of American plutocracy. Edith funded programs for juvenile justice in Chicago, supported the Art Institute, helped establish Chicago's first opera company, and later gave the land that would become Brookfield Zoo. Harold was active in aviation, in cultural sponsorship, in the social machinery of a city that rewarded generosity with prestige. Together, they represented something the early 20th century wanted to believe about American wealth: that it could be beautiful, that it could be useful, that the children of tycoons and industrialists could become patrons and citizens rather than merely heirs. That public image matters because it makes the private story so much more unsettling. The city's gratitude and the household's instability existed simultaneously, and neither could see the other clearly. The Lake Forest Lake Bluff History Museum preserves photographs from this period that function as the story's visual anchors. Harold and Edith, with their sons Jack and Fowler, around 1900. Matilda watching for her father's aeroplane from the beach in 1913, a child inside luxury and spectacle, the father overhead, the great house behind her, and what the museum considers the last family portrait taken together, around 1918. Edith and Muriel seated, Matilda, Fowler, and Harold standing. 5 people, 1 pose. The last image of the household intact. That 1918 photograph is a gift to the documentary because anyone looking at it now, knowing what followed, the divorce, the scandal, the custody battles, the trust litigation, the fractions of a will that measured love in twelfths, can see a family holding a pose it was about to abandon forever. The stillness in that image is not peace. It is the last moment before movement, and the movement, when it came, would scatter every person in that frame across different cities, different countries, different decades of managed wreckage. The house on the bluff was magnificent. The gardens were immaculate. The civic contributions were generous and real. But the household inside those walls had been wrong for years, shadowed by 2 infant deaths that were mourned in public and managed in private, shaped by the widening distance between a mother drawn to Zurich and the strange, liberating interior world of Jungian analysis, and a father anchored to Chicago, to business, to the outward continuity of the name. By the early 1920s, later accounts would describe the pattern bluntly. Edith in Switzerland, Harold in downtown Chicago, and the children alternating between parents whose lives had already separated in everything but legal form. Even if one treats those summaries cautiously, the broad pattern is confirmed across every available source. The household existed in fragments long before the divorce made the fragmentation official. And at the center of it all was a family code that answered every crisis, not with intimacy, but with instruments, trusts, committees, separate residences, settlements drawn up by lawyers in language the children could not yet read, but would spend their adult lives deciphering. The most important thing to understand about this family before the story moves forward is this: the children were not neglected in any visible sense. They were administered, fed, clothed, supervised, educated, accounted for, and administered. And administration, however well-funded and however carefully designed, is not love. It is the thing that replaces love when love has become too dangerous or too complicated to attempt. That last family portrait, the 5 of them, composed and still, would be the final image of the household before it broke. Within 3 years, Edith would file for divorce in a proceeding so rapid that contemporaries remarked upon its efficiency. Within 5, Matilda would be married to her Swiss writing instructor in a London registry office, while the family's lawyers scrambled to manage a scandal they could not prevent. Within a decade, the fortune itself would be diminished by debt and the crash. The trust structures would begin speaking louder than any surviving family member, and the children would discover that what they had truly inherited was not protection. It was not permanence, and it was certainly not freedom. The house would stand for another generation. The family inside it would not. What life looked like inside the household during the years when it was still functioning depended entirely on where you stood. From the outside, from the vantage of Chicago society, from the pages of the newspapers, from the perspective of the thousands of civic beneficiaries who received Edith's philanthropy and Harold's patronage, the McCormick household at Villa Turicum was the most enviable domestic arrangement in America. The long elm-lined mall leading to the palazzo on the bluff, the terraced gardens descending toward Lake Michigan, the private beach where Harold kept his aeroplane, a machine so modern and so casually possessed that it turned the lakefront into a theater of progress, the opera boxes, the art collections, the dinner tables at which Chicago's most powerful families gathered, where conversation moved between industry and culture with the ease of people who believed themselves responsible for both. This was not inherited aristocracy. This was something the early 20th century considered more impressive. Earned supremacy, legitimized by philanthropy, softened by taste, and made permanent, or so it seemed, or by the sheer weight of the money behind it. Oh, for the children, the texture of those years was different. They lived inside the spectacle without possessing it. The nurseries at Villa Turicum were staffed by nurses and governesses. The routines were precise. The expectations were calibrated to the family's public position, correct behavior, correct manners, correct dress, the kind of childhood that photographs well and that produces, in the children who survive it, a particular fluency in performance and a particular inability to describe what they actually felt. Fowler, as the eldest surviving son after John's death, carried the name's weight most visibly. He was expected to be ready, ready for the business, ready for the board, ready to step into the role that the McCormick dynasty had prepared for him since before he was born. Muriel, quieter by temperament, moved through the household with less friction and less attention. And Matilda, the youngest, born into a family already marked by loss, absorbed whatever atmosphere the house contained without the language to name it. There is something about the rhythm of those years that the documentary should render carefully, because the happiness was not entirely false. Harold's enthusiasm for aviation was genuine. A wealthy man's passion, certainly, but also a real delight in modernity, in the sensation of flight, in the future that machines were building. The photographs of him at Lake Forest, with the plane on the sand, carry an energy that is not merely performative. He believed in progress. He believed in the family. He believed, with the conviction of a man whose entire world confirmed his authority, that the life he was providing was a good one. Edith, too, during the early years, was not merely playing a role. Her support for civic institutions was driven by genuine intellectual ambition and a desire to make Chicago something more than an industrial capital. She wanted culture, she wanted justice, she wanted the city to reflect the seriousness she felt inside herself. The tragedy is not that these were hollow people performing happiness. The tragedy is that their forms of happiness were incompatible, and the household they had built together could sustain both only for a limited time. The social world surrounding them was dense and specific. Chicago in the early 1900s was a city in the process of inventing its own aristocracy, not through titles or lineage, but through the interplay of industrial wealth, cultural patronage, and real estate prestige. The McCormicks sat at the top of that pyramid. Their circle included the Palmers, the Fields, the Swifts, the Armours, families whose names were attached to department stores and meatpacking empires and lakefront hotels, families who together formed a society that was younger and louder and more nakedly commercial than its Eastern equivalents, but no less rigorous in its expectations. To be among them was to be visible. To be visible was to be watched. And to be watched was to understand, from childhood. The private feeling was secondary to public composure. The McCormick children learned that lesson before they learned much else. They had no choice. The seasonal rhythms of the household reinforced the lesson. Summers at Villa Turicum, with the lake below and the gardens in full formality, Winters in the Chicago residence on Lakeshore Drive, and with the social calendar dictating appearances, charity events, opera evenings, the machinery of upper-class obligation turning with the regularity of the Harvester Company's production schedules. There were visits to Kykewit, to the Rockefeller estate where little John had died, visits freighted with the particular tension of a daughter's relationship with a disapproving father, conducted in a house that held the memory of a dead grandchild in its walls. And there were the family occasions that required all the principals to appear as a unit: portraits, public events, moments when the fiction of a harmonious household had to be maintained with the discipline of a stage performance. The children moved through all of this. They attended, they behaved, they posed, and underneath the posing, they absorbed a truth that no one was stating aloud. The family looked complete, but it did not feel complete. And the difference between looking and feeling was the central fact of their childhood. One detail from the period stands as a kind of emblem. In 1913, when Matilda was 8 years old, the Lake Forest Museum preserves an image of her watching from the beach for her father's aeroplane. It is a photograph of a child gazing upward, waiting for a father who is literally above her, suspended in the sky, modern, exciting, unreachable. The great house stands behind her. The lake stretches before her. She is surrounded by every material advantage the early 20th century could provide, and she is looking up, waiting. That image could stand for the entire childhood of all three surviving McCormick children, surrounded by magnificence, waiting for something that was always just out of reach. The first signs of genuine trouble arrived not as scandal, but as distance. Edith's depression, documented in later accounts, was not a single episode but a recurring condition that deepened over years. What the public saw was a brilliant woman expanding her interests, traveling, studying, engaging with intellectual movements that most of her social peers found bewildering. What was happening beneath that public image was a woman in genuine psychological distress, searching for systems of meaning that could contain what her marriage and her family's expectations could not. By 1913, the search had taken physical form. Edith left for Zurich. She entered the orbit of Carl Jung, at that time one of the most controversial and intellectually ambitious figures in European psychology. She did not simply visit, she stayed. She studied. She underwent analysis. She trained as an analyst herself. And she began developing a relationship with Jungian thought, with its emphasis on the unconscious, on archetypes, on the deep structures beneath personality, that would, over the following years, become the organizing principle of her inner life. That departure must be understood in its full complexity, because it was not a simple abandonment and it was not a simple act of liberation. Edith was genuinely unwell. She was genuinely searching, and she was genuinely absent from her children for extended periods during years that mattered enormously to their development. The household she left behind was Harold's household. Ordered, conventional, staffed, maintained, and the children grew up inside it with a father who was present in body and committed to routine, but who could not replace what a mother's presence might have provided. The specific emotional atmosphere of a home, run by a business executive who keeps the machinery of domestic life turning smoothly, without the warmth or the chaos of the absent parent, is a particular kind of childhood. It is not abuse, it is not neglect, it is administration. And the children knew the difference, even if they could not yet articulate it. Meanwhile, the financial tensions that would later destroy the family's stability were already forming beneath the surface of apparent limitless wealth. Edith's relationship with money was profoundly different from her father's, and that difference was not merely a matter of personal temperament. It was a generational war conducted through expenditure. John D. Rockefeller Sr. believed in thrift, control, and the careful stewardship of every dollar. He had built the greatest fortune in America on the principle that money was a moral responsibility, not a pleasure. Edith believed in spending, on art, on causes, on real estate, on Jung, on the intellectual and cultural life she wanted to live rather than the managed, thrifty existence her father had designed for his children. The rift between them widened with every expenditure. Rockefeller Sr. disapproved of his daughter's extravagance. He disliked her esoteric interests. He resented the way she spent money that he considered, even after giving it to her through trusts, to be in some fundamental sense still his, still subject to his standards, still accountable to his vision of what a Rockefeller fortune was for. Edith, for her part, experienced her father's disapproval as a continuation of the gendered hierarchy she had grown up inside. The son received trust and autonomy. The daughters received money with conditions. By the time she returned from Europe in 1921, Edith was burdened with more than $800,000 of debt and was borrowing against dwindling trust income. That figure deserves emphasis. $800,000 in 1921 was an enormous sum, and the fact that a Rockefeller daughter could accumulate such debt while still nominally possessing a vast fortune illustrates the distinction that would define her children's inheritance, the difference between wealth as a number on paper and wealth as actual freedom. Edith's money was real. It was also controlled by trusts, by committees, by her father's legal architecture, by the terms of instruments she had not designed and could not easily modify. She could spend, she could borrow, she could not simply access. That gap between theoretical fortune and practical cash would widen until it consumed her, and after her death, it would consume her children's relationship with one another. The marriage, by this point, was a marriage in name only. Harold remained in Chicago. Edith remained in Zurich, or in her own Chicago orbit upon return, surrounded by a circle of associates and interests that bore little resemblance to the world of International Harvester, board meetings, and Lake Forest social calendars. The household that had once occupied Villa Turicum as a single unit now existed as fragments. Separate residences, separate lives, separate loyalties, held together only by the legal fiction of a marriage that had lost its emotional substance years earlier. The children moved between these fragments. They knew their mother and their father as separate worlds, and the passage between those worlds was managed not by family feeling, but by arrangement. Visits were scheduled, residences were assigned, boundaries were maintained. The family had become in effect a custody agreement that had not yet been formalized, and the children were its subjects before they were its witnesses. And then the formal break came. On the 28th of December, 1921, Edith obtained a divorce from Harold in Chicago. Contemporary reports describe the proceeding as remarkably rapid, the kind of efficient, almost clinical legal event that the wealthy arrange when they want the public record to be as brief as the private agony has been long. The decree included no provision for alimony, and the settlement architecture was designed to end open warfare while preserving whatever discretion could still be preserved. But discretion did not mean peace. Edith's PBS profile indicates that Harold had threatened to sue for adultery, and that the settlement terms deepened her already considerable debt. What the public saw was a brief legal proceeding on a December afternoon. What was actually happening was the final dismantling of a household that had once represented the most powerful marriage in America, conducted not with grief or ceremony, but with the brisk efficiency of a business closing its accounts. The marriage ended not with catharsis, not with confrontation, not with the kind of dramatic scene that might have given the participants, and especially the children, some recognizable emotional shape to hang their loss upon. It ended with paperwork, and that was exactly right for this family. Because in a household that had always converted feeling into structure, the dissolution of the marriage was simply the final structural rearrangement, the last trust instrument, the last legal allocation, the last managed transition from one administrative arrangement to another. The children did not experience their parents' divorce as a sudden rupture. They experienced it as the formalization of a separation that had been their reality for years. What changed was not the distance between their parents. What changed was that the distance now had legal language attached to it, and the legal language carried consequences that would reach forward through the rest of their lives. The terms of the settlement, the provisions of the trusts, the architecture of custody, all of it would continue operating on the children long after the decree was signed, long after the courtroom was empty, long after December the 28th, 1921 had become just another date in the family's calendar of administered pain. But the divorce was not the only fracture of those years, and it was not even the most publicly devastating one. Running parallel to the disintegration of the marriage, and in many ways accelerating it, was the crisis of Matilda. Matilda McCormick was 16 years old in 1921, and she was in love with Max Ozer. Ozer was a Swiss riding instructor, a man of no particular fortune and no particular social standing beyond what his competence with horses and his easy continental manner could provide. He was 44 years old. She was a teenager who had grown up inside a household where the adults communicated through lawyers, where love was translated into trust instruments, and where every significant decision was made by committee. The gap between Matilda and Ozer was not merely one of age. It was a gap of world, of experience, of power, of everything that the McCormick-Rockefeller name was supposed to protect its children from. And yet Matilda wanted him. She wanted him with the fierce, unyielding certainty of a young woman who had spent her entire childhood watching other people's choices being managed and administered and controlled, and who had found in this one unsuitable attachment something that felt like it belonged to her. There's something about Matilda's choice that must be understood in the context of the household that produced it. She was the youngest child. She was the daughter of a mother who had spent years in Zurich pursuing her own form of rebellion against patriarchal management. She was the sister of a brother being groomed for corporate leadership and a sister who had already begun her quiet drift into managed adulthood. Matilda had watched the family's code in operation for her entire conscious life. Structure over feeling, arrangement over desire, committee over confession. And her response to that code was the most direct possible rejection of it. She chose a man the family could not absorb. Not a fellow heir, not a suitable young American with the right schools and the right family connections and the right willingness to be folded into the dynasty's apparatus. She chose a writing instructor from Switzerland, 28 years older. It was not random. It was the logical product of a household that had offered her everything except the right to want something for herself. The family's response was instructive because it revealed more about the family than it did about Matilda. It was not an outpouring of parental concern or an honest conversation about the risks of the relationship or a genuine attempt to understand what their youngest daughter wanted and why she wanted it. It was a legal maneuver. Reports from early 1922 indicate that Harold sought appointment of a guardian for Matilda in a way that Edith believed was designed to secure consent for or potentially to block the marriage under Swiss legal provisions. The mechanism was guardianship, the language was custody, the reality was control. The youngest surviving daughter of one of America's most powerful households had become, in effect, a problem to be allocated by legal authority. Not a child to be listened to, not a young woman whose desires, however alarming, might be worth understanding. A problem to be solved by the same tools the family had always reached for: lawyers, courts, appointments, instruments. The family's first major fracture was therefore not simply husband versus wife. It was parents versus child, and each parent was using structure differently. Harold to maintain control, Edith to resist it. With Matilda caught between them, her romantic life turned into a jurisdictional question. The emotional beat of that moment deserves its full weight. A teenage girl, raised in a 44-room palazzo by nurses and governed by trustees, had fallen in love with the writing instructor. It was the oldest story in the world, the heiress and the man of no particular standing. And it was also something more specific than that. Matilda's choice was the child's version of her mother's lifelong resistance to patriarchal management. Edith has spent years fighting the family's control over her life, her money, her choices. Matilda, too young to fight through lawyers and trusts, fought through the only weapon available to her. She chose someone the family could not absorb. Max Oser was not a man who could be placed on a board, invited to a dinner, folded into the dynasty's social architecture. He was by every measure the family valued wrong. And that was precisely the point. Matilda's rebellion was not random. It was the logical product of a household that had offered her everything except the right to want something for herself. The press, naturally, was ecstatic. An American heiress, a Rockefeller granddaughter, and her Swiss writing master. The story had everything the newspaper of the early 1920s demanded: wealth, youth, scandal, forbidden romance, the delicious spectacle of a great family unable to control his youngest daughter. Coverage appeared across the United States and in European papers, and the tone was almost uniformly gleeful. Editors who had spent years printing flattering accounts of McCormick philanthropy now discovered that the family's dysfunction sold even better than its generosity. The public that had admired the McCormicks for their grandeur now consumed the McCormicks for their failures, and the shift happened with the speed that only scandal can produce. One season, Edith and Harold were Chicago's first family. The next, they were a cautionary tale about what happened when too much money met too little parental authority. The coverage was cruel, not because it exaggerated, but because it revealed, stripped away the careful management of image that the family had spent decades constructing and exposed the chaos beneath. The children experienced that shift not as distant spectators, but as its subjects. Fowler watched his youngest sister become an international scandal and understood, with the instinct of a son who had been groomed for corporate leadership, that his own composure would now be required to compensate for her rebellion. Muriel watched the family name turn from asset to liability and retreated further into the quieter life that was becoming her pattern. And Matilda herself discovered something that every child of wealth eventually learns when they push against the boundaries of the system. Wanting something outside the structure did not free you from the structure. It simply made the structure more visible, more punishing, and more determined to reassert itself. Each family member's response to the fracture should be tracked, because the divergence that would define the next decade began here. Edith, newly divorced, her finances deteriorating, her relationship with her father strained past repair, continued living as if sheer will could outface humiliation. She announced plans to marry Edwin Kren, the architect and intimate associate whose name would later appear so explosively in her will, then abandoned those plans without public explanation. She drew press attention for increasingly esoteric public statements, including a claimed past life connection to a child bride in the household of Tutankhamun. The temptation is to treat this material as evidence of eccentricity or decline, and the documentary should resist that temptation. What was happening was something more complex and more painful than madness. Edith was constructing alternate systems of meaning at the very moment her marriage, her finances, and her authority as a mother were all collapsing simultaneously. She was reaching for a version of reality that could accommodate what she had lost, because the version of reality offered by her father, her former husband, and the world of Chicago society could not hold her any longer. She was, in her way, still fighting, but the battlefield had shifted from trust law and custody arrangements to the interior landscape of the psyche, and the public watching from outside could see only the strangeness. Harold, meanwhile, remarried, goes quickly and spectacularly as to Gana Walska, a Polish opera singer whose own fame and temperament guaranteed that the private wreckage of the McCormick household would remain public entertainment for months and years to come. Walska was glamorous, dramatic, and entirely unsuited to the role of corporate wife that Edith had occupied with such difficulty. Harold's choice of second wife was, in its own way, as revealing as Matilda's choice of Ozer. It suggested a man who had spent decades inside a marriage defined by duty and obligation, and who now wanted something entirely different, something exciting, something beautiful, something that had nothing to do with committees and trusts and the carefully managed expectations of two industrial dynasties. That the marriage to Walska would itself end in divorce only deepened the pattern. The McCormick men were no better at escaping the family's emotional architecture than the McCormick women. They simply escaped into different kinds of failure. For the children, Harold's remarriage created yet another layer of displacement. They were already navigating between two separate parental worlds. Now they had to navigate a third, the world of their father's glamorous new wife, a world of opera and European society and public spectacle that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with Harold's determination to move forward as visibly as possible from the marriage that had defined the first half of his adult life. Fowler, as the surviving son, absorbed the lesson that would define his adult life. Composure and continuity would be expected of him. He was the child who could still be placed in the dynasty's public role. He was the heir who could sit in a boardroom without scandal attached to his name. That usefulness came at a cost, the cost of never being permitted his own form of rebellion, his own unsuitable attachment, his own departure from the script the family had written for him. Muriel, less visible in the headlines, began the quieter pattern that would characterize her later years. A life shaped not by dramatic choices, but by gradual absorption into managed structures, older attachments, and the slow accumulation of legal vulnerability that would eventually define her entirely. And Matilda moved deeper into the scandal, deeper into the attachment the family could not accept, and closer to the London marriage that would settle nothing. The immediate consequences of the divorce and the Matilda crisis were long-lasting in ways that the family could not have predicted and that the public could only glimpse through the occasional newspaper report. Edith and Harold continued appearing in court over the terms of the divorce agreement, their post-marital relationship conducted entirely through solicitors and legal filings. The children moved into a world in which the family was no longer a household but a series of competing claims. Claims over residence, income, custody, approval, reputation. The legal instruments that had always governed the family's money now governed its emotional life as well. Trust documents determined who received what. Custody arrangements determined who lived where. Guardianship appointments determined who controlled Matilda's future. The family had always believed in structure as the answer to disorder. Now structure was all that remained. The love, the intimacy, the shared life that structure was supposed to protect had evaporated, and what was left was the machinery, running on its own, processing the people inside it according to rules they had not written and could not change. There is a particular cruelty in that arrangement, and it should be named plainly. The children did not step out of their parents' divorce into freedom. They stepped into administration. They moved from a household that was managed into a post-divorce landscape that was litigated. Every significant decision about their lives, where they lived, how much money they received, who had authority over their choices, was now determined not by parental love or even parental preference, but by legal agreement, committee oversight, and the architecture of trust that their grandfather had designed decades earlier for purposes that had nothing to do with the emotional welfare of the grandchildren who now lived inside them. The family's most enduring creation was not Villa Turicum. It was not the opera company or the zoo or the medical institute. It was the legal machinery that continued operating on its children long after any semblance of family life had ceased. And the children could feel it. They could feel the difference between being cared for and being processed, between being loved and being allocated, between belonging to a family and belonging to a trust. The positions were now fixed in the ways that would determine the rest of each child's life. Fowler was the functioning heir, the son who could sit in a boardroom, who could carry the McCormick name into the next generation of corporate leadership, who could be useful to the dynasty in the most fundamental sense available. He was 23 years old in 1921, old enough to understand exactly what the divorce and the scandal meant for the family's public standing, and young enough to be shaped permanently by the lesson he drew from it. Composure was survival. Composure and continuity would be expected of him, and he would deliver both. For decades, at whatever private cost that delivery required. That usefulness was his role and his prison. Muriel was already drifting into the quieter, less legible pattern that would characterize her adulthood, a pattern of attachment to older, established figures, of gradual absorption into structures she had not chosen, of a life that would become visible to history only through the court documents that marked its boundaries. And Matilda was moving toward the decision that would define her publicly and permanently. The London marriage that was now months away and that every adult in the family was trying, through legal and financial and familial pressure, to prevent. None of them could prevent it. The legal divorce was over, but the real break was only beginning. A teenage Rockefeller-McCormick daughter was about to walk into a London registry office with a man 28 years her senior, listed in the register as a soldier and a spinster respectively. And every adult in the family was about to learn that money can delay scandal, structure can manage custody, lawyers can draft agreements, and trustees can withhold funds. But none of it, not one instrument in the entire arsenal of American dynastic control, can prevent a young woman from making the choice that will follow her to an early grave. In April of 1923, in a London registry office, Matilda McCormick married Max Ozer. She was 18 years old. He was 46. The register recorded him as a soldier and her as a spinster of independent means. Those two phrases, set beside each other on a government form, contain the entire story of what this marriage was and what it was not. Ozer was not a soldier in any conventional military sense. The description was a courtesy, a social fiction, a way of giving a man, with no particular social standing, a title that would look respectable on a legal document beside the name McCormick. And Matilda was not independent in any meaningful sense either. She had means, certainly, money that flowed through the Rockefeller Trust structures and the McCormick settlement architecture, but independence was the one thing that money of that kind did not provide. It came with oversight, it came with committees, it came with her uncle, John D. Rockefeller Jr., and his careful eye on the family's collective interest, and she could spend, but she could not escape the instruments that governed the spending. She stood in that registry office, thousands of miles from Chicago and Villa Turicum, and the household that had produced her, and she was still, would always be, a McCormick. The name followed her across the Atlantic. The trusts followed her. The consequences followed her. She had not escaped. She had merely changed the location of her captivity. And the man beside her, 28 years her senior, could offer her affection and perhaps even love. But he could not offer her what she most needed, a life outside the reach of the machinery that had governed every significant decision of her childhood. No person could offer that. The machinery was not a person. It was a system. And systems do not release their subjects because those subjects fall in love. The family's reaction to the marriage was not surprise. They had seen it coming for more than a year and had attempted, through legal maneuver, guardianship petitions, and the combined weight of parental and institutional pressure, to prevent it. What they could not have anticipated was the permanence of its consequences. Matilda's marriage to Uzer was not a youthful episode that would burn out and be forgotten. It was the defining act of her life, the choice around which every subsequent event would organize itself. Her children by Ozer, Anita, and Peter Max would later appear in the trust litigation that followed Edith's death, their names written into legal documents as evidence of how far the family's original structure had been stretched by choices its architects never foresaw. The teenage girl who had wanted only to love the wrong man had, in doing so, created a new branch of the dynasty that the old instruments would have to accommodate, and the accommodation would be neither smooth nor generous. There is something both poignant and ruthless about that. Even rebellion in this family eventually became subject to the machinery. Even love became a line item in a trust dispute. But the marriage had consequences beyond the legal. It changed the way the family was perceived, not just by the press, which had always been eager to consume the McCormick's dysfunction, but by the social world that the family inhabited. The Matilda-Oser marriage was proof, in the most public possible form, that the McCormick-Rockefeller system of control had limits. A teenage daughter had defied it, a Swiss riding instructor had entered it, and neither the Rockefeller Trust nor the McCormick boardrooms nor the combined legal resources of two of the most powerful families in America had been able to prevent it. That failure mattered. It told the world that the dynasty was not as secure as it appeared, and it told the children, Fowler and Muriel as much as Matilda, that the system they lived inside was both oppressive and brittle. It could control their money, it could administer their custody, it could manage the terms of their daily existence down to the last legal detail, but it could not prevent them from wanting things it had not authorized. And wanting in this family was the most dangerous thing of all. The years between 1923 and 1932, the last decade of Edith's life, should be understood as a period of simultaneous fragmentation and display. The family was coming apart, person by person, trust by trust, decision by decision. It was also still performing. The McCormick name still appeared in newspapers. The Rockefeller connection still carried weight. The institutions Edith had helped create, the opera, the zoo, the civic programs, still functioned. But the household that had once given the name its domestic meaning no longer existed. What remained was a set of individuals orbiting the same fortune at different distances, connected not by shared life, but by shared legal instruments. Edith, in particular, occupied a paradoxical position during these years that deserves careful attention. She was more publicly visible than ever, and she was more privately desperate than anyone outside her immediate circle could have known. Her return to Chicago after the divorce had not brought the stability that a return home might suggest. It had brought a different kind of theater, grander in some ways, stranger in others, and increasingly disconnected from the social world that had once claimed her as its queen. She established herself as a patron, a hostess, a figure of cultural authority in the Chicago of the 1920s. But the authority was increasingly eccentric, and the patronage was increasingly funded by debt. She backed unusual intellectual projects. She supported artists and thinkers whose work the Chicago establishment regarded with bewilderment. She made public statements about reincarnation and past life connections that drew ridicule from the press and genuine alarm from her family. In 1923, within days of Harold's remarriage to Ganowalska, she drew headlines for claiming a past life link to the household of Tutankhamun, a claim that, whatever its spiritual sincerity, could not have been more precisely timed to alarm a father whose entire philosophy of wealth rested on Baptist propriety and the careful management of public appearances. There is something about Edith during these years that requires careful handling, because the easy interpretation, and that she was losing her grip on reality, is both reductive and unkind. What the evidence actually shows is a woman of genuine intellectual ambition who had exhausted the conventional frameworks available to her and was building new ones from the materials at hand. Her marriage had failed. Her father disapproved of her. Her money was controlled by trusts she could not modify and overseen by committees she could not dismiss. Her children were growing up in a world she had helped create but could no longer govern. The systems of meaning that had sustained her for decades, wealth, social position, family, the Rockefeller name, the role of patron and wife and mother, and had all been revealed as insufficient. And so she turned to other systems: Jungian analysis, reincarnation, esoteric philosophy, mystical connection to ancient civilizations. These were not the hobbies of a dilettante amusing herself between social engagements. They were the last resort of a woman who had run out of ordinary places to stand. The tragedy is not that Edith was strange. The tragedy is that the world she inhabited, the world of trusts and committees and managed respectability, left her no conventional ground to stand on, and so she built her own ground. And the people around her could see only the strangeness of the construction, not the desperation that had made it necessary. Her relationship with Edwin Kren deepened during this period, and it became the subject of public speculation that the family found increasingly difficult to manage. Kren was an architect, a business associate, and an intimate companion whose exact role in Edith's life resisted easy categorization. He was not her husband. He was not, by any public account, her lover in any sense the press could confirm, but he was present. He was influential, and he would eventually appear in her will in terms that would shock her children and the public alike. The nature of the Kren relationship matters less for this story than its effect. It further isolated Edith from the family's expectations and further convinced her father and her former husband and her brother that she was operating outside the boundaries of acceptable Rockefeller behavior. Every move she made during these years, every esoteric statement, every financial overreach, every public eccentricity tightened the noose of family disapproval around her. And that disapproval was not merely emotional, it was administrative. The trusts could be tightened, the committees could reduce her access. The family's control over her financial life could be made more restrictive. Edith's eccentricity was not just embarrassing, it was expensive. And in this family, the line between moral judgment and financial consequence was drawn by lawyers. Harold, during these same years, was pursuing his own version of post-divorce reinvention, and it was hardly more successful than Edith's, though it drew less ridicule because it conformed more closely to what the world expected of a wealthy man. His marriage to Gena Walska, the Polish opera singer, had taken place in 1922 with a speed that suggested a man determined to replace one grand narrative with another. Walska was glamorous, temperamental, and entirely unsuited to the life of a McCormick corporate wife, which was, of course, precisely the point. Harold had spent 26 years married to a Rockefeller daughter, navigating committees and trust and the expectations of two industrial dynasties. He wanted something different, something beautiful and dramatic and free from the weight of institutional obligation. What he got was a marriage that the public found endlessly entertaining and that would itself end in divorce, leaving him neither free nor settled, but merely older, with the pattern of failed intimacy now doubled. For the children, their father's second marriage was another layer of displacement added to an already unstable architecture. Harold with Walska was not Harold the father they had known, the steady, conventional figure who kept the household running while Edith was in Zurich. He was Harold in pursuit of his own desire, his own escape from the dynasty's emotional flatness. And the children had to reckon with the discovery that their father, too, was capable of choices that had nothing to do with them. That reckoning was quieter than the Matilda scandal and less intellectually strange than Edith's esoteric turn, but it was no less disorienting. The parent who had represented stability was not stable. He was merely better at managing the appearance of stability, and appearances, the children were learning, were the family's most reliable product and its most deceptive one. Meanwhile, the children's lives were taking shapes that would have been legible to anyone willing to look closely, though what those shapes revealed was not comfort, but repetition. Each child was, in their own way, reproducing the patterns of the household that had formed them, and none of them appeared to recognize it. Fowler was moving into the business world with the quiet competence the dynasty required. He had not rebelled. He had not scandalized. He had not run off with a writing instructor or claimed spiritual communion with ancient Egypt. He had accepted the role that his birth order and his gender and his family's expectation had prepared for him since childhood, and he was filling it with the steady, unremarkable efficiency of a man who understood, perhaps better than either of his sisters ever could, that in this family, being useful was the only form of safety available. He joined the machinery of International Harvester as if stepping onto a conveyor belt that had been running since before his birth, waiting for the moment when the eldest, Woodwith's surviving son, would take his place. He moved through the ranks. He attended the meetings. He learned the language of corporate governance that was for the McCormicks also the language of family identity. And he prepared with the same methodical patience to marry. His marriage to Fifi Potter Stillman, which took place in 1931, confirmed the pattern that all three siblings would share. An older spouse, already formed, already socially established, already carrying the weight of their own public history and private complication. Fifi was a woman of considerable wealth and considerable notoriety, older than Fowler by a meaningful margin, previously married to James A. Stillman, the president of National City Bank, in a union that had produced one of the most spectacular and widely followed divorce cases in American history. The Stillman divorce had involved allegations of adultery, questions of paternity, and the kind of tabloid coverage that leaves permanent marks on everyone it touches. Fifi had survived it. She had emerged scarred, but standing, a woman who understood from her own experience what it meant to live inside a famous name, while the machinery of wealth and law and public scrutiny ground away at the private person beneath. That Fowler chose her, chose specifically a woman who had already survived her own version of the McCormick experience, says something important about what he was looking for in a partner. Not innocence, not simplicity, not escape from the world he knew. He was looking for familiarity. The familiarity of someone who already understood, without being told, what it meant to maintain composure while the family around you fell apart. The familiarity of someone who had already learned that in families of this kind, the public version and the private version are never the same, and the effort required to maintain the gap between them is the central labor of daily life. Fowler did not marry outside the pattern. He married deeper into it. Muriel's trajectory was quieter, but no less determined by the family's gravitational field. Her marriage to Elisha Dyer Hubbard, a man from an old Rhode Island family, and considerably older than she was, placed her inside another version of the structured, socially legible world that the McCormick-Rockefeller name seemed to demand of its women. Hubbard was respectable, established, connected to political and social networks that provide the appearance of settled adulthood, the appearance of the very thing that Muriel's own childhood had so conspicuously lacked. The surface of Muriel's life was smooth. She was married. She was situated. She appeared from the outside to have navigated the family's dysfunction without visible damage. Underneath that surface, she was already becoming the family member whose existence would be most thoroughly processed by the legal machinery her grandfather had built. She was not dramatic. She was not rebellious. She did not make headlines. She was accommodating, agreeable, present in the ways the family expected, and absent in the ways that would have required confrontation. And in this family, accommodation was not safety. It was vulnerability. The instruments of control operated most effectively on the people who did not fight them, because those people never developed the reflexes, the legal instincts, the financial cunning, the willingness to make public scenes that would be necessary when the machinery turned against them. Muriel would discover that truth in the decades to come in custody courts and trust disputes that would strip her life down to its legal skeleton. But during the 1920s, she was still young enough to believe that compliance was protection. It was not. It was merely the quietest form of surrender. Matilda, in Europe with Ozer, had chosen the opposite path and was discovering that opposition carried its own kind of imprisonment. She had fought. She had scandalized. She had married the man her family could not absorb, and the cost of that fight was becoming visible in the quiet arithmetic of her daily life. She was not living the existence of a liberated woman who had broken free of dynastic control. She was living the life of a young mother in a European household, raising children named Anita and Peter Max, tied to a choice she had made at 18 with the passionate certainty of adolescence, increasingly distant from the American world that had produced her and increasingly dependent on the trust income that connected her. Whether she liked it or not, to the family, she had defied. The irony of Matilda's position was almost unbearable. She had married Oser precisely because he represented something outside the McCormick-Rockefeller system, something human-scaled, something chosen rather than administered. But she could not sustain a life outside that system without its money. And the money came with strings that ran all the way back to her grandfather's office and her uncle's committee. Every month, trust income crossed the Atlantic from New York to wherever Matilda was living, and every month that income reminded her that the rebellion had limits. She could choose her husband. She could not choose her inheritance. She could live in Europe. She could not live free of the instruments that followed her there. The writing instructor's wife was still a Rockefeller granddaughter, and the trust did not care about love. They cared about fractions, about corpus, about the legal definition of issue. Those words would catch up with Matilda eventually. They caught up with everyone in this family. Max Ozer himself occupied a strange position in this story, the outsider who had entered the system through desire and found himself trapped inside it almost as thoroughly as the people who had been born there. He had married one of the wealthiest young women in America, but the wealth was not his to command. It was administered. It was supervised. It flowed through channels he had not designed and could not influence. He was the husband of a McCormick daughter, which meant he was adjacent to power without possessing it, connected to money without controlling it, bound to a family that had never wanted him and would never fully accept him. His death in 1942, 5 years before Matilda's own, would mark another quiet subtraction from a family that was running out of people faster than it was running out of legal disputes. The rebellion had not freed Matilda. It had relocated her, and the relocation had not brought peace. It had brought a different kind of confinement, smaller, more private, less gilded, but no less enclosing than the palazzo on the bluff, where she had once watched for her father's aeroplane from the beach. By the late 1920s, the architecture of the family's finances was under strain from a direction that no trust instrument and no family committee could have anticipated, and that no amount of Rockefeller discipline or McCormick industrial competence could deflect. The stock market crash of October 1929 did not destroy the Rockefeller fortune in the way that it destroyed lesser fortunes. The trusts were too diversified, the institutional holdings too vast, the legal architecture too deeply embedded in the financial system to be swept away by a single market event. John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s genius had always been structural, and the structures he had built were designed to survive precisely this kind of shock. But survival and immunity are not the same thing. The crash damaged the value of assets across every portfolio. It reduced income from investments that had seemed permanent. It tightened the terms on which money could be borrowed against future returns. And it accelerated the financial pressures that had been building around Edith for years with a force that no amount of committee management, no trust adjustment, no family intervention could absorb. She had been borrowing against trust income for the better part of a decade. She had been spending beyond what the trust could sustain. She had accumulated debt that no Rockefeller was supposed to accumulate in amounts that no Rockefeller daughter was supposed to require. And now the crash had reduced the value of the underlying assets, shrinking the already inadequate gap between what she owed and what she could access to something close to crisis. The newspapers, which had once described Edith as one of the wealthiest women in America, a fortune estimated at roughly $40 million, began revising their assessments with the enthusiasm that the press always brings to the humiliation of the formerly exalted. By 1931, the picture was stark. Edith could not obtain more money from her father, a man who was still alive, still in possession of one of the largest fortunes in the world, and who had decided that his daughter's spending was beyond the reach of his sympathy. The trusts were producing less income. The debts were mounting with the remorseless momentum of compound interest on obligations that had been accumulating for years. And so she arranged, through Cartier, to sell some of her jewels. A transaction that, for a woman of Edith's public stature, amounted to an admission of financial distress more devastating than any public statement could have been. These were not ordinary jewels being sold for convenience. These were the visible symbols of a Rockefeller-McCormick life. Stones that had been worn at opera openings and society dinners, that had sparkled under the chandeliers of Villa Turicum, that had been purchased in the years when the money still felt limitless and the future still seemed secure. Selling them was not a financial transaction. It was a public confession. The woman who had built Villa Turicum, who had funded opera companies and juvenile courts and zoological gardens, who had once moved through the highest rooms in Chicago with the serene authority of someone for whom money was atmosphere rather than concern. That woman was liquidating the physical evidence of her former life to service debts that her father's fortune should have made impossible. The gap between public image and private reality, which had been the central fact of this family's existence for 3 decades, had never yawned wider or more cruelly. That financial collapse, the revelation that the fortune was not what everyone had assumed, that the machinery of wealth could consume its own operators, that even the name Rockefeller did not guarantee permanent solvency, and was the second great fracture in this family's story. The first had been the divorce, which shattered the household. The second was the crash and its aftermath, which shattered the illusion that the money at least was safe. The children had already lost their family as a functioning unit. Now they were losing the certainty that the fortune would protect them from the consequences of that loss. The trust still existed. The income still flowed, diminished but not eliminated. But this sense of limitless security, the belief that whatever else went wrong, whatever scandals erupted, whatever marriages failed or children rebelled, the money would hold, was gone. And without that belief, the family had nothing left to organize itself around. Not love, which had been converted into legal language years ago. not shared life, which had been fragmented across continents, not even wealth in the simple, reassuring sense of having more than enough, only structure, only the instruments themselves running according to their own logic, processing the people inside them toward outcomes that no one had intended and no one could reverse. Edith's health, by the early 1930s, was failing in ways that could no longer be managed or concealed. The cancer that would kill her was advancing. The woman who had once moved through Chicago society with the authority of someone whose name was synonymous with American power was now confined to a suite at the Drake Hotel, not Villa Turicum, not the Lakeshore Drive residence, not any of the grand settings the public associated with her, but a hotel room in downtown Chicago. That detail matters more than almost any other in this story because it completes the arc of the family's relationship with place. Villa Turicum, the 44-room palazzo on the bluff, the formal gardens, the elm-lined mall, the terraces descending toward the lake, still stood in Lake Forest. It would stand for another 24 years before being demolished in 1956 after years of dormancy and vandalism, its rooms emptied, its gardens overgrown, its purpose exhausted. But Edith was not there. The great house that had been designed to embody permanence had outlived its usefulness to the woman who built it. She had no claim on it any longer. The divorce, the debt, the crash, the long erosion of her financial position had stripped away every grand setting the family had once inhabited, and what remained was a hotel suite. Comfortable, adequate, impersonal, and rented. The woman who had spent $5 million building a palace above the lake was dying in a room that any person with sufficient funds could have occupied for a night. The children were now adults. Fowler was 33, Muriel 29, Matilda 27, and they were old enough to understand the full scope of what was happening. Not just the illness, which was visible and advancing, not just the financial ruin, which had been building for years and was now beyond disguise, but the entire arc of their mother's life, visible now in its final compression. The Cleveland childhood under Rockefeller discipline, the Chicago marriage to McCormick duty, the splendor of Villa Turicum, the Zurich years with Jung, the divorce, the esoteric public persona, the spending and the debt, the crash and the selling of jewels through Cartier, and now the cancer, all of it converging on a hotel room where the last Rockefeller daughter of her generation was dying with less practical freedom than she had possessed at any point since her adolescence. They could see it all. They could feel the weight of it, and they could do nothing to change it. Because the instruments that governed their mother's money also governed their relationship to her estate, and those instruments were about to activate in ways that would determine the shape of their lives for decades to come. What the children did not yet know, what they could not have anticipated even if they had read every trust document in their grandfather's files, was the specific shape that their inheritance would take. They did not know that their mother's will would distribute her personal estate in fractions that read like a ranking of love: 1/12 to Fowler, 2/12 to Matilda, 4/12 to Muriel, and 5/12, the largest single share, to Edwin Kren, the architect, the intimate, the man who was not family and who had no legal claim on the name McCormick. They did not know that the will would transform grief into insult, mourning into arithmetic, and the question of what a mother felt about her children into a problem for probate courts. That knowledge was still ahead of them, waiting in the paperwork that would follow the death that was now in the summer of 1932, only weeks away. One child would embody public continuity, stepping into the dynasty's corporate role with the composure of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for precisely this moment. One would drift deeper into the managed structures that had always defined her existence, her life becoming legible to history only through custody disputes and trust litigation and the dry language of California appellate courts. And one would die young, at 42, in a state far from Chicago, having spent her adult life attached to the choice she had made at 18. A choice that had looked like the only available freedom and had turned out to be another form of the inheritance she was trying to escape. The family had money enough for everyone. What it no longer had, what it had perhaps never truly had, was a center. And without a center, what the children were about to inherit was not a fortune in the way that word is usually understood. It was a set of fractions, administered by committees, contested by lawyers, measured in twelfths, and the most devastating fraction of all, and the 5/12 left not to any child but to Edwin Kren, had not yet been read aloud. By the summer of 1932, the machinery that had governed this family for decades was approaching its final operation. Edith Rockefeller McCormick was dying, and the systems that had managed her money, her marriage, her children, and her public image were about to perform their last function: the conversion of a mother's death into a legal event. The trusts were waiting, the will was written, the fractions had been assigned. All that remained was the death itself. And the death was coming with the kind of slow, undeniable certainty that cancer imposes on those who watch it arrive. The preceding months had stripped away the last pretenses of the life Edith had constructed. Her financial position, already devastated by years of overspending and the post crash contraction, had deteriorated past any possibility of recovery. The estate that the press had once valued at $40 million was now revealed as something far more precarious: a construction of real estate, furnishings, trust structures, and accumulated debt rather than the liquid freedom that the public associated with the Rockefeller name. The properties that had defined her public image were either no longer hers or encumbered beyond their practical value. Villa Turicum, the 44-room palazzo on its 300-acre bluff, stood in Lake Forest like a monument to ambitions that the money could no longer sustain. The Lakeshore Drive residence was gone. The jewels had been sold through Cartier. What remained was the income from her father's 1917 trust, reduced, supervised, allocated by committee, and the personal property she could still legally claim, and a body that was failing with the indifference that disease brings to every human distinction, including wealth. The cancer had been advancing through the spring and into the humid Chicago summer. The diagnosis was not publicly detailed in the contemporary press with the clinical specificity that later decades would bring to the deaths of public figures, but the trajectory was unmistakable. Edith was weakening. She was confined increasingly to her suite at the Drake Hotel, the commercial accommodation that had replaced every grander setting in her life. The woman who had once moved between Villa Turicum and Lakeshore Drive and Kaikwit and Zurich, who had inhabited spaces designed to project the permanence of American dynastic wealth, was now contained within hotel walls that belonged to no one and carried no history beyond the succession of guests who had occupied them before. She was 60 years old. She had been born in Cleveland into the wealthiest family in America, had married in Chicago into one of its most powerful industrial dynasties, had built a house above a lake and imagined it as permanent, had crossed an ocean to study the unconscious mind with one of the most original thinkers in European psychology, had funded opera and juvenile courts and a zoological garden, had divorced, had borrowed against her father's structures, had claimed lives she had not lived, had been ridiculed and admired and pitied and envied in roughly equal measure, and now she was dying in a rented room. The compression of that trajectory into a suite at the Drake is one of the story's most devastating details, not because the Drake was degrading. It was a luxury hotel and the suite was comfortable, but because it was impersonal. It belonged to no one. It carried no claim to legacy. It was shelter, nothing more. And for a woman who had spent her adult life trying to build things that would outlast her, houses, institutions, intellectual systems, and a version of the self that could survive the body, dying in a space that would be cleaned and occupied by a stranger within days was the final, unintended commentary on everything she had attempted and everything the fortune had failed to protect. The family began to gather in August. Reports noted John D. Rockefeller Jr. hurrying to Chicago to see his ill sister, a journey that carried its own emotional weight, because the relationship between Edith and her brother had been defined for decades by the same imbalance that had shaped her entire life. He was the son, she was the daughter. He had received the centrality and the trust of their father's world. She had received money with conditions. And now he was coming to Chicago, not as the brother who had supported her through her difficulties, but as the family's representative, the committee chairman, the person whose administrative authority would continue operating on Edith's children long after her death. His arrival at the Drake was an act of familial duty. It was also, whether he intended it or not, an assertion of the very authority that Edith had spent her life resisting. The gathering of the original household was more emotionally charged still. It marked the first time the surviving members of the McCormick family unit had been together since the divorce in 1921. 11 years had passed, the marriage had ended, Harold had married Ganna Wolska and divorced her too. Matilda had married Ozer, Muriel had married Hubbard, Fowler had married Fifi. The family that had once posed together for the 1918 portrait and the last image of the household intact had not occupied the same room in more than a decade. And now they were returning, drawn not by reconciliation or desire, but by the simple, overriding fact of impending death. Harold came. The former husband, the man who had once threatened to sue Edith for adultery, who had secured custody advantages through lawyers and guardianship petitions, who had remarried and divorced again, who had remained the steady, conventional, publicly presentable face of the McCormick name throughout every crisis. Harold came to the Drake to see the woman he had married 37 years earlier. What passed between them in that hotel room cannot be known with certainty. The historical record offers the fact of his presence, but not the words he spoke. What can be said is that he was there, and that his being there required him to occupy the same space as the consequences of decisions that both of them had made. Decisions about money, custody, children, lawyers, the architecture of a divorce that had been designed for efficiency rather than emotional resolution. He was 60 years old, the same age as Edith. He had 9 years left to live. And he was standing in a hotel room watching the mother of his children die. The 3 surviving children came. Fowler, the eldest, 33 years old, already moving into the executive role at International Harvester that would define his public life. Muriel, 29, married to Hubbard, quiet, present. The child whose defining characteristic had always been her willingness to appear where she was needed without making demands. And Matilda, 27, the youngest, the one whose teenage rebellion had once made her the most famous of the 3, who had married her riding instructor in London 9 years earlier, and who now returned to Chicago from Europe to stand beside a dying mother she had not seen in the ordinary rhythms of daily life for years. Each of them carried into that room the specific weight of what the family had done to them and what they had done to themselves in response. Fowler carried composure. Muriel carried compliance. Matilda carried the scar of scandal and the knowledge that her mother, whatever else she had been, had at least understood what it meant to want something the family could not approve. They gathered, they waited, and in that waiting, in the hours and days when a dying woman's breathing fills a hotel room and the people around her have nothing to do but sit with one another and with the accumulated history of their shared life, something happened that the documentary should acknowledge without overstating. The family was together. Not healed, not reconciled, not restored to anything resembling the unit that had once inhabited Villa Turicum, that had once posed for the 1918 portrait, that had once existed in the public imagination as the most envied household in America, but together physically in the same room for the first time in 11 years. The divorce had separated them. The scandal had scattered them. The trusts and committees and legal instruments had processed them into separate administrative categories, separate households, separate continents. And now death was pulling them back into proximity. Not because death resolves anything, because it does not, but because death, unlike trust and custody arrangements and guardianship petitions, cannot be managed from a distance. You have to be present for it. You have to be in the room. You have to sit in a chair and listen to the breathing change and look at the faces of people you once lived with and have not seen in years and recognize in those faces the passage of time and the accumulation of damage that no family gathering can undo. What passed between them during those final days cannot be reconstructed with certainty. The historical record is generous with dates and legal details and financial figures, but it is silent on the specific words spoken in that hotel room. The gestures made, the silences that fell between people who had too much history and too little practice at intimacy to know how to be with one another in the presence of death. What is known is that they were there. What is known is that the reunion came too late to repair what the preceding decades had broken. What is known is that the woman in the bed had once been the center of a household that the world envied, and that the people around her bed were the evidence of what that household had actually produced. Not continuity, not happiness, not the successful transmission of love across generations, but 3 damaged adults who had arrived at their mother's deathbed carrying the specific forms of injury that the family's code had inflicted on each of them. The last days of August 1932 in that Drake Hotel suite should be rendered with restraint, because restraint is what the moment demands. There were no grand speeches. There were no dramatic reconciliations. There was no moment when the family suddenly understood one another and forgave the accumulated damage of 3 decades. What there was, by every available account, was presence. The family was there. They sat with Edith. They watched the cancer do what cancer does. And they existed for a few final days in the same physical space, breathing the same hotel air, hearing the same sounds from Michigan Avenue below, sharing the particular helplessness that surrounds a deathbed when the dying person is someone you love and have also been hurt by, and have also hurt and cannot now reach in any way that would make a difference. On the 25th of August, 1932, a Thursday, Edith Rockefeller McCormick died. She was 60 years old. She was in a bedroom at the Drake Hotel in Chicago, a room that looked out onto a city she had once helped shape, and that had in turn shaped and broken and celebrated and pitied her in roughly equal measure. Her former husband was present or nearby. Her three surviving children, the three who had made it through the scarlet fever and the infancy deaths and the divorce and the scandal and the trust disputes and the decade of fragmentation that had followed, were there. The August heat of Chicago pressed against the hotel windows. The sounds of Michigan Avenue rose from below, and inside the room, the particular silence that precedes a death by illness. The silence that is not quiet, but rather the absence of the struggle that has been filling the room for days, settled over everything. Time magazine would later describe the scene with the bluntness that characterized its period style, reducing the end of a life that had spanned Cleveland and Chicago and Zurich and Lake Forest, and the innermost chambers of American plutocratic culture to a few spare sentences about death arriving at the door of a hotel bedroom. That bluntness was, in its way, the most honest treatment the scene could receive. Because what happened at the Drake on August the 25th was not dramatic in the way that the word is usually understood. There was no confrontation. There was no revelation. There was no final act of will that redeemed or condemned. There was only a woman dying, surrounded by people who had once been her family and who had, over the course of 3 decades, been converted by the machinery of wealth and law and managed respectability into something else, something that still bore the name of family, but that functioned, in practice, as a set of legal relationships, financial obligations, and administered connections. Edith died. That sentence should be allowed to stand on its own for a moment, because what followed would move so quickly and so relentlessly that this simple human fact of a woman's death risks being buried beneath the paperwork it triggered. She died. A woman who had been born into the wealthiest family in America, who had married into one of its most powerful industrial dynasties, who had built a house on a bluff above a lake and imagined it as something that would endure beyond her, who had crossed an ocean to study the hidden architecture of the human mind, who had claimed lives she had not lived and debts she could not pay, and connections to ancient civilizations that nobody around her could verify. That woman died in a hotel room in August, and the people in the room with her were the people who had loved her most imperfectly and whom she had loved most imperfectly in return. That is not a lesson. That is just a life. There was a beat of stillness. There is always a beat of stillness when someone dies, a moment suspended between the world in which the person existed and the world in which they do not, a moment when the room holds its breath, and the living look at one another across the new absence, and the fact of irreversibility settles over everything. In that silence, before the telephone calls began and the solicitors were notified and the press learned what had happened and the public began composing its version of the story, the family existed in its most essential and most stripped-down form. 4 people in a room with a body. A former husband who had once threatened to sue for adultery and who had come to the Drake anyway. A son who had been trained since childhood to hold everything together. 2 daughters, one quiet, one scandalous, who had spent their adult lives navigating the consequences of their parents' failures. And the woman who had been wife and mother and patient and patron and rebel and eccentric and debtor and Rockefeller daughter and McCormick bride and Jungian analyst, and at the very end, merely a person dying of cancer in a city where she had once been the most celebrated woman in the room. The stillness held for as long as stillness ever holds in families like this. Then it broke, and the machinery started. The public response came first, or at least most visibly. Thousands would later come to Graceland Cemetery, the same cemetery where the great names of Chicago's plutocratic age lay beneath their monuments, the same ground where the city's industrial and cultural elite had been buried for decades, drawn by the Rockefeller name and by the spectacle of a dynasty's most troubled daughter finally coming to rest. The newspapers covered the death with the mixture of reverence and calculation that American journalism of the period specialized in. They acknowledged the philanthropy. They noted the eccentricities with the carefully restrained tone of obituaries that must be respectful while also being entertaining. They calculated the estate, but tried to, discovering in the process that the fortune once associated with Edith was far more diminished than anyone outside the family's inner circle had known. And they speculated about the will because in America, as in all countries where wealth is worshipped and its distribution is treated as a public concern, the question of who inherits is never merely private, it is a story. And stories about money have audiences that stories about grief do not. The public version of Edith's life was already being composed before her body was cold, and it was, as all public versions of complicated lives inevitably are, a simplification. The queen of Chicago society, the eccentric Rockefeller daughter, the woman who claimed past lives, the patron who went bankrupt. Each phrase captured something real and missed something essential, and the woman who had spent 6 decades trying to construct a self that could contain all her contradictions was reduced in death to the 2 or 3 details that fit most neatly into a headline: the private reality, the depression, the genuine intellectual ambition, the financial desperation. The children she had ranked in 12ths was not yet part of the public story. It would take decades for the full picture to emerge, and even then it would remain incomplete, because some things about families are never fully known to anyone outside them, and some things are not fully known even to the people inside them. But the private aftermath was where the real devastation began. Edith's will was read, and its contents detonated inside the family with a force that no legal instrument is supposed to carry. The personal estate was distributed in fractions that read like a testament not of love, but of hierarchy, resentment, and inexplicable loyalty. 1/12 to Fowler, not 2/12 to Matilda, 4/12 to Muriel, and 5/12, the largest single share, larger than any child's portion, to Edwin D. Kren. There is something about those fractions that requires a moment of stillness to absorb. 1/12, that was what Edith left to her eldest surviving son, the man who had spent his adult life preparing to carry the McCormick name into the next generation, the child who had done everything the dynasty asked of him. 1/12, a fraction so small it felt less like an inheritance than a rebuke. 2/12 to Mathilde, the rebel daughter, the one who had married against the family's wishes, slightly more favored than her brother, but hardly generously. 4/12 to Muriel, the quiet one, the compliant one, receiving the largest share among the children, which might have read as preference or might have read as recognition of vulnerability. And 5/12 to Kren, the architect, the intimate, the man who was not family and whose exact relationship to Edith had been the subject of years of private speculation and public gossip. The children did not simply lose their mother on the 25th of August, 1932. They were measured by her. They were ranked. They were told, in the language of testamentary fractions, exactly where they stood in her final accounting of what mattered and what did not. And the man who stood above all of them, the man who received more than any child, more than any blood relative, more than any person who had borne the name McCormick or Rockefeller, was someone from outside the family, someone the dynasty had never wanted, someone whose presence in the will must have felt, to those 3 children sitting in the still warm aftermath of their mother's death, like the final confirmation of something they had always suspected, but had never been forced to confront in such arithmetical terms. They had never been enough. The household they had grown up inside, for all its splendor and all its administration, had not produced the kind of love that a mother distributes equally among her children. It had produced fractions, and the fractions were merciless. 1/12 to the son who had done everything right, 5/12 to the man who had done nothing the family approved of. There is no way to soften that. There is no interpretation that makes it less devastating. Whatever Kren meant to Edith, companion, collaborator, the last person who made her feel understood, his presence in the will at that proportion was an act of posthumous violence against the 3 people who had grown up calling her mother. It did not matter that the personal estate was diminished, that the real money lay in the Rockefeller Trust, that the fractions applied to an estate already badly damaged by debt and depreciation. What mattered was the message, and the message was clear. In the final ranking of Edith Rockefeller McCormick's loyalties, her children came second to a man who was not family, not blood, not bound to her by any instrument that the Rockefeller McCormick system recognized as legitimate. Fowler absorbed the blow with the composure that had become his defining characteristic. He was the son. He was the heir. He had spent his adult life learning to absorb institutional demands without visible reaction. And the will, however painful, was simply another institutional demand to be processed and endured. He would go on. He would carry the name. He would serve the company. That was what was expected of him, an expectation for Fowler. had long since replaced any other emotional compass. Muriel's response was different, and in the context of what would follow, more revealing. She objected. She sought a more favorable interpretation of the trust, an interpretation that would have given in her a greater portion of the Rockefeller Trust principle through the exercise of the power of appointment in Edith's will. The legal arguments were technical, the emotional argument was not. Muriel, the quiet one, the compliant one, the child who had never made headlines, was fighting. She was fighting through the only means this family had ever provided: lawyers, courts, the language of trust instruments. And she was fighting against her own siblings, because in a family where love had been converted into legal architecture, sibling relationships were also legal relationships. And disagreements about love were also disagreements about money, and disagreements about money were resolved by judges. The separate machinery of John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s 1917 trust then activated, adding another layer of legal complexity to the grief. That trust, created by Edith's father 15 years before her death, had provided income to her during her lifetime and specified that upon her death, the principal would be divided into equal shares for her surviving children, unless a valid exercise of the power of appointment in Edith's will displaced that default distribution. The legal question was technical. Had Edith validly exercised the power? Did the terms of her will, with its startling fractions, override the trust's default equal division? The emotional question was not technical at all. It was the question that had haunted this family from the beginning. Who controls the money, and what does that control mean for the people who live inside its reach? Muriel objected, seeking a more favorable interpretation of the trust through her mother's will. An interpretation that would have given her a greater portion of the Rockefeller Trust principle. The other children and the trustees resisted. The dispute moved into the courts, and a New York appellate decision laid out the competing claims with the kind of clinical precision that family pain assumes when it enters legal proceedings. The emotions drained away, the relationships reduced to definitions, the people converted into parties, the love and resentment and grief and confusion translated into the vocabulary of trusts and estates. Issue, corpus, appointment, principal, income. These were the words that now described the McCormick children's relationship to their mother and to one another. The language of family had been fully and irrevocably replaced by the language of law. John D. Rockefeller Jr., Edith's younger brother, the only son, the one who had always received the privilege of centrality within the Rockefeller household, appeared in the aftermath not as a grieving sibling offering comfort to his nieces and nephew, but as a committee chairman. Reports on the children's trust income specified a committee headed by him. That fact should be stated plainly and allowed to resonate, because it encapsulates the entire story in a single administrative detail. The children's uncle was also their administrator. The family elder was also the mechanism. The person who occupied the role that in other families might have belonged to a warm, avuncular figure offering guidance and consolation was in this family the person who controlled the flow of money, supervised the terms of distribution, and chaired the committee that determined how much the children received and under what conditions. There was no separation between kinship and oversight. There never had been. And Edith's death did not create that collapse of roles. It merely made it permanent. Edith's death ended the marriage story. It ended the story of a woman who had spent her life fighting for a form of autonomy that neither her father's world nor her husband's world could accommodate. It ended the Zurich years and the esoteric claims and the financial overreach and the selling of jewels through Cartier. But it did not end the children's story. It activated it. Because everything that happened after the 25th of August, 1932, the trust litigation, the custody disputes, the adoption controversies, the corporate ascent, the early deaths, the demolition of the house on the bluff, all of it flowed from this moment. From a woman dying in a hotel room, from a will that ranked her children below her architect, from a trust that converted grief into legal arithmetic, and from a family code that had always believed structure could substitute for love, and that discovered at the end that structure was all it had left. The years ahead would reveal what the fortune actually did to the survivors. One child would be converted into the dynasty's functioning public face and would carry that role for decades, useful and imprisoned in equal measure. One would drift into custody wars, adoption disputes, and trust litigation that would continue past her own death, her life becoming fully legible only through the language of California appellate courts. And one would die at 42, in a state far from Chicago, having never escaped the choice she made at 18, a choice the family had tried to prevent and that the family's own rigidity had made inevitable. The machinery was running. The people inside it had no way to stop it. And the fractions, 1/12, 2/12s, 4/12s, 5/12s, would echo through every subsequent legal proceeding, every family dispute, every quiet moment when one of Edith's children sat alone with the knowledge of what their mother had decided they were worth. The years ahead would show what the fortune actually did to each of them. One child would carry the McCormick name into the boardroom of International Harvester, becoming president and then chairman, embodying public continuity so completely that there would be nothing left of him that was not the role. No private rebellion, no unsuitable attachment, no visible crack in the composure that the dynasty demanded and that he delivered decade after decade, at whatever cost he paid in the rooms where no one was watching. One would lose her husband, fight her brother in court over custody of adopted children, and die with a $10 million trust, terminating at her death while strangers in a California appellate court debated whether the children she had loved counted as issue under instruments she had never written. And one would die at 42, far from Chicago, the girl who had married her writing instructor at 18, having discovered that the choice, which had looked like the only available escape, was, in the end, just another sentence in the family's ongoing litigation with itself. None of them would escape the machinery. None of them had ever been designed to. The trust litigation moved through the courts with the unhurried efficiency of legal proceedings that involve large sums of money and no urgency beyond the patience of the parties and the calendars of judges who have other cases to consider. The dispute was technical in form. Questions of trust interpretation, of testamentary powers, of the legal meaning of provisions drafted by John D. Rockefeller Sr. in 1917, but emotional in substance. Because what the children were really arguing about beneath the legal language was what their mother had intended and what their grandfather had designed, and whether the two intentions could be reconciled. By 1934 and 1935, newspaper reports and court records were making the resolution clear. The trust would be divided equally among the three surviving children, despite Muriel's sustained efforts to secure a more favorable reading through the terms of Edith's will. That equal division, when it came, was narratively perfect in the most bitter possible way. After a lifetime shaped by hierarchy, a household in which the only son was privileged over the daughters, in which the father's approval was distributed according to gendered expectations that no one questioned aloud, in which the mother's will had ranked her own children in fractions that measured something other than equal love. The children received formal equality only through litigation. The courts imposed what the family had never been able to produce on its own: an even distribution, 1/3 to each surviving child, simple, clean, impersonal, the kind of arithmetic that ordinary families take for granted and that this family had to fight for in courtrooms while lawyers billed by the hour and judges weighed the meaning of words written by a man who had never imagined that his grandchildren would need a court to tell them they were equal. But even then, even after the courts had spoken and the division was settled, the principle remained under control. The income was supervised through the committee structure that John D. Rockefeller Jr. chaired. The money flowed, but it flowed through channels that the children had not designed and could not modify, governed by instruments they had not drafted and overseen by a committee whose chairman was their uncle. Their uncle, who was also, simultaneously and without any sense of contradiction, the administrator of their financial lives, the person who determined how much they received and when they received it, and under what conditions the flow could be adjusted. Equal did not mean free. It meant equally administered. And administration, as this family had demonstrated across 3 decades and 2 generations, and 5 children, and 2 divorces, and 1 death in a hotel room, was the substitute for love, not its expression, but its replacement, offered when love itself had become too dangerous or too complicated or too honest to attempt. The dynastic center, by the mid-1930s, could no longer be described as a family in any intimate sense. It was a set of descendant lines, trusts, committees, and reputations moving on separate tracks through a world that was itself changing. The Depression giving way to war, the old industrial order giving way to new configurations of power, the Gilded Age certainties that had built the Rockefeller and McCormick fortunes giving way to a modernity that had less use for the kind of patriarchal, institutional, committee-governed family life that John D. Rockefeller Sr. had constructed. The machinery kept running. But the world around it was no longer the world it had been designed for. And so the three surviving children of Edith Rockefeller McCormick and Harold Fowler McCormick moved into their separate futures, carrying the specific forms of damage the family had inflicted on each of them, and the specific versions of the family code each had absorbed. Their paths diverged not because they chose different lives, but because the family's machinery had assigned them different roles. And the roles determined the trajectories as surely as railway tracks determine the destination of a train. Fowler would carry the name. Muriel would carry the compliance. Matilda would carry the rebellion, and each of them would discover, across the decades that followed, that the role the family had assigned was not a costume that could be removed at the end of the performance. It was the performance, it was the self. The family had made them, and what the family had made could not be unmade by distance, by marriage, by the passage of time, or by the slow accumulation of years in which the original household receded further and further into memory while its effects continued operating on the people it had produced. The generational echoes of this family's dysfunction should be named explicitly here, because the pattern that runs through every surviving child's life is too precise and too consistent to be left unmarked. Wealth as management rather than comfort. Every crisis in this family was met not with emotional response, but with institutional action. Grief became memorial funds, conflict became custody proceedings, love became fractions in a will. Female dependence inside enormous wealth. Edith grew up secondary to her brother, and her daughters later lived inside male-controlled legal structures, despite possessing what the London Registry called independent means. The older spouse pattern, Fowler, Muriel, and Matilde, all married partners significantly older than themselves, reaching for the formed authority that their own childhood had never provided. Public grandeur and private fragmentation. The more magnificent the estate and the more impressive the civic image, the more scattered and damaged the household became. And beneath all of these, the inheritance that was not money, the inheritance of structure, of scrutiny, of the inability to form ordinary adult attachments, of the deep, unshakable knowledge that in this family you were not loved, you were allocated. Fowler became outwardly the success story. In another family, a family less thoroughly documented in legal records and less comprehensively processed by the machinery of dynastic wealth, his trajectory might have been presented as triumph. He rose through international harvester with the inevitability of a man whose name was on the building and whose grandfather had built the machine that the building housed. He served as president from 1941 to 1946, taking the helm during the war years when the company's industrial capacity was directed toward military production and when the ability to manage a vast manufacturing enterprise under wartime condition required exactly the kind of steady, unemotional competence that Fowler had been trained to provide since childhood. He became chairman from 1946 to 1951, presiding over the post-war transition when International Harvester was still one of the most significant manufacturing enterprises in America, and when the company's future was being reshaped by forces, labor relations, technological change, international competition, that the founder Cyrus McCormick could not have imagined. Fowler navigated all of it. He occupied boardrooms with the quiet confidence of a man who had been rehearsing for those rooms since the day he was born. He made decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. He carried the McCormick name into the mid-20th century with the composure and competence that 3 generations of industrial dynasty had demanded of their heirs, and he never not once gave the world any reason to doubt that the name was in capable hands. His marriage to Fifi Potter Stillman provided the kind of social establishment the family expected, a wife who understood wealth from the inside, who understood scandal from personal experience, who understood the exhausting gap between public image and private reality, because she had spent years surviving her own version of it in the aftermath of her first marriage. Together, Fowler and Fifi presented the world with the image of a McCormick household that functioned. Whether it functioned in the intimate, emotionally sustaining sense that the word usually implies is a question the record does not fully answer. What the record shows is a partnership between two people who had both been shaped by families that valued appearance over feeling and who had both learned to maintain the appearance with professional discipline. But Fowler's success should not be mistaken for freedom, and the documentary should resist the temptation to treat his corporate career as evidence that at least one of Edith's children emerged unscathed. He was the child who could function in public, and that functionality was both his contribution and his confinement. He never rebelled. He never made headlines for the wrong reasons. He never chose an unsuitable partner or claimed a past life or accumulated debts that shamed the family. He did everything that was asked of him, and what was asked of him consumed the space where a private self might otherwise have existed. The son who carries the dynasty forward does not carry it lightly. He carries it at the cost of whatever he might have been in the absence of the duty. Fowler McCormick died on the 14th of October, 1973, at the age of 74. He had outlived both his sisters. He had outlived both his parents by decades. He had outlived the house on the bluff, demolished 17 years before his death. And he had outlived, in some essential sense, the dynasty itself, because by 1973, the household that had once occupied Villa Turicum existed only as a legal afterlife. Trust instruments, court decisions, archival photographs, and the fading memory of something that had once been called a family. Harold Fowler McCormick Sr. died in 1941, 9 years after Edith, at the age of 69. By then, the first-generation marriage had long since ended in every sense. Legally, emotionally, physically, symbolically. Harold's second marriage to Ganna Walska had also ended in divorce, proving that the McCormick men were no more capable than the McCormick women of building lasting domestic arrangements outside the dynasty's gravitational field. Harold had tried. He had married twice. He had maintained his position at international harvester through every personal crisis. He had kept a public face polished with the discipline of a man who believed, correctly, within the terms of his own world, that public composure was the highest form of character. But behind that polished surface was a man who had spent the second half of his life navigating the aftermath of a marriage that had defined him and a household that had broken around him. He had been the father who stayed in Chicago while Edith went to Zurich. He had been the parent who used lawyers and guardianship petitions to manage what conversation could not resolve. He had been the husband who threatened adultery proceedings and then settled for a clinical divorce on a December afternoon. And he had been, in the years after the marriage ended, a man looking for something: excitement, beauty, escape from the flatness of corporate propriety, and a second wife who could provide spectacle but not stability. The children were left with a father who had been present and competent and administratively reliable, and who had never, by any surviving account, offered them the kind of emotional openness that might have countered the damage their mother's absences and eccentricities had inflicted. Harold was a good executive. Whether he was a good father is a question the historical record cannot fully answer, and perhaps the most honest thing to say is that in a family where fathering was indistinguishable from administering, the distinction was never given the chance to matter. Matilda's death came next, and it came early, and it came quietly, which was perhaps the cruelest irony of all, given that her life had been defined by the loudest scandal the family had ever produced. On the 18th of May, 1947, Matilda McCormick Ozer died in California. She was 42 years old. The teenage girl whose romance with a Swiss writing instructor had once drawn international headlines, whose marriage in a London registry office had been reported in newspapers across 2 continents, whose rebellion against the family's control had looked for one bright, defiant moment, like the assertion of a self that the dynasty could not contain. That girl had become a woman who lived quietly, raised her children, Anita and Peter Max, remained attached to the choice she had made at 18, with the unyielding constancy of someone who had staked everything on a single decision and could not afford to admit that the decision might have been wrong. Max Ozer had died 5 years earlier, in 1942. Matilda had spent the last 5 years of her life as a widow at 37, connected to the McCormick-Rockefeller world by trust income and legal identity, and the children whose names would later appear in the probate documents of a family they had entered through love rather than blood. The writing instructor's wife had outlived the writing instructor and would not outlive him by long. 5 years. That is all the time Matilda had between her husband's death and her own. 5 years in which she was, for perhaps the first time in her life, neither a daughter being managed by her parents' machinery nor a wife defined by a scandalous marriage. She was a widow. She was a mother. She was 42 years old in California, far from Chicago and the bluff above the lake and the registry office in London, where she had once signed her name beside a Swiss writing instructor's, which was about as far from the world that produced her as it was possible to travel while remaining in the same country. And then she was gone. Her death should be placed in the narrative with pace rather than dwelt upon as a second climax, because it is not a second climax, it is evidence. It is the quiet proof of what this story has been arguing since the beginning. That none of the surviving children of Edith and Harold McCormick got the long, ordinary, self determined adulthood that their name and their wealth and the grandeur of the house they grew up in seemed to promise. Matilda's rebellion had been the most dramatic. Her departure from the family script had been the most complete. And her death was the quietest of all, a woman ending at 42, in a state she had not grown up in, having lived exactly the kind of short, geographically displaced, emotionally constricted life that the family's rigidity had made inevitable from the moment she first defied it. She had not escaped the machinery. She had merely found a different location in which to be processed by it. Muriel's later life was the longest and in many ways the most quietly devastating of the three surviving children's trajectories, because it demonstrated most completely what the family's machinery could do to a person who did not fight it. After Elisha Dyer Hubbard's death in 1936, Muriel was a widow in her early 30s, young enough to build a different kind of life, wealthy enough in the managed, supervised, committee-governed way that Rockefeller Trust beneficiaries were wealthy, and profoundly alone in the specific way that people who have never been taught to build independent lives are alone when the structures around them begin to thin. Her husband was gone. Her mother was gone. Her father would be gone within 5 years. And the world she inhabited, the world of trust income and committee oversight and the McCormick-Rockefeller name, was not a world that rewarded the qualities Muriel possessed: quietness, compliance, the willingness to be present without making demands. What followed was a life defined increasingly by legal proceedings and institutional conflict rather than by the domestic peace that Muriel's temperament seemed to seek. By the late 1940s, she and Fowler were in open court conflict over custody arrangements involving her adopted children. The details of the dispute resist easy summary, but the shape of it is heartbreakingly clear. A brother and a sister, both damaged by the same household, both carrying the same inherited instinct for converting personal conflict into legal action, fighting each other in court over children who should have been beyond the reach of the family's administrative machinery, but who were not, because in this family, nothing was ever beyond the reach of the machinery. After Muriel's death on the 18th of March, 1959, the legal system performed its final operation on her life. A California appellate court was tasked with determining whether her adopted children counted as issue under the Rockefeller Trust instruments, a trust of roughly $10 million that terminated at her death and whose proceeds were to be distributed according to terms drafted decades before adoption was a common practice among the wealthy. The competing claims came from charities, which argued that adopted children were not issue in the sense the trust's drafter had intended, and from the adopted children themselves, who argued that they were Muriel's children in every sense that mattered and should be treated as such under the law. The question the court had to answer was, at its root, a question about what family meant when family was defined by legal instruments rather than by love. Did Muriel's children, the children she had chosen, the children she had raised, the children she had loved, in whatever way the daughter of Edith Rockefeller McCormick was capable of loving, count? Did they qualify, under provisions written by a man who had been dead for more than 20 years, as the kind of descendants he had intended to benefit? Were they family, or were they something else? Something the trust could not accommodate because the trust's vocabulary had been fixed in an era when the word issue meant biological offspring and nothing more. It is difficult to imagine a cleaner demonstration of this story's thesis. Even motherhood, the most fundamental human relationship, the bond that in most families is assumed rather than argued, had become, in the McCormick-Rockefeller world, a legal question requiring judicial determination, a question for courts, a question of interpretation and precedent and statutory construction. Muriel's last act as a mother, however unintentional, was to force a court to decide whether her children were real. And the court's answer, whatever it was, could not undo the fact that the question had been asked at all. No amount of legal reasoning could repair the damage of a family system in which a mother's love for her adopted children had to be validated by judges before it could be translated into dollars. In terms of the family's cultural afterlife, there does not appear to be a major scripted film or television drama devoted specifically to Edith Rockefeller, McCormick, and her children. No equivalent of the dramatizations that have brought other American dynasties into the living rooms of millions. The strongest screen treatment is PBS's American Experience documentary on the Rockefellers, which situates Edith within the larger family saga, but gives her story, and particularly the story of what happened to her children, the compressed treatment that a multi-generational survey necessarily imposes. Edith appears in that documentary as one figure among many, one branch of a vast family tree, one thread in a narrative that has John D. Rockefeller Sr. and John D. Rockefeller Jr. at its center. The children barely register. The trust, the fractions, the custody wars, the older spouse pattern, the specific textures of damage that the household inflicted on each of its survivors, none of that makes it into the broader Rockefeller story, because the broader story has other priorities. In print, the picture is richer. Clarice Stosh's The Rockefeller Women opened a door that had been largely closed, examining the lives of the Rockefeller daughters, including Edith, with a seriousness that the family's male-centered historiography had not previously allowed. And Andrea Friederici Ross's Edith the Rogue. Rockefeller McCormick provided the first full biography focused on Edith herself, treating her not as an eccentric footnote in her father's story, but as a figure of genuine complexity and genuine tragedy, whose intellectual ambitions and personal failures deserve to be understood on their own terms. Ross's biography brought Edith out of the margins and into the foreground, and in doing so made visible the story that this documentary tells, the story of what happened not to the Rockefeller fortune, but to the people inside it. The screen version of that story, the interior story, the story of what the trust documents and the custody proceedings and the will's devastating fractions actually felt like to the people who lived through them, has not yet been made. The documentary this script serves has a claim worth stating plainly. Screen culture has shown the Rockefeller dynasty in its public dimension, as an institution, as a philanthropy, as a force in American history. This film shows what that dynasty cost, what it did to one daughter who married into another dynasty and tried to build something permanent, what it did to the children who grew up inside the structure and spent their adult lives trying, in their different ways, to escape it, and who discovered that the machinery was always faster, always more patient, and always more thorough than they were. No principal figure in this story is alive now. Edith died in 1932, Harold in 1941, Matilda in 1947, Muriel in 1959, Fowler in 1973. The family that once posed together in the 1918 portrait, the five of them, composed and motionless, holding the shape of a household that was already fracturing beneath the formal surface, has been gone for more than half a century. What remains is therefore not a living dynasty or a surviving witness who can tell you what it felt like to grow up inside those walls. What remains is a physical and institutional afterlife, scattered across the American landscape in fragments that are visible only to those who know where to look and what to look for. Brookfield Zoo still stands on the land that Edith helped donate to the Forest Preserve District of Cook County, and her name survives in the institution's plant-giving culture, a legacy of genuine civic generosity that outlasted the woman who provided it and the household that produced her. The zoo is real. The animals are real. The visitors who walk through its gates on summer afternoons in Chicago do not think about Edith Rockefeller McCormick or about the trust structures and personal catastrophes that lay behind her philanthropy. They think about the exhibits and the weather and the children pulling at their hands. That is perhaps the kindest thing that can be said about Edith's legacy. Some of what she built escaped the family's emotional gravity and became simply useful, simply present, simply part of the city she once tried to shape. The John Rockefeller McCormick Memorial and the infectious disease research it supported persisted for decades in medical and scholarly publications, carrying the name of a 3-year-old boy who died of scarlet fever at Kikwit in 1901 into a world of laboratories and journals that he could not have imagined. That memorial was the family's first conversion of grief into institution, and it lasted longer than almost anything else the household produced. The little boy who died before his 4th birthday outlasted, in institutional form, the house, the marriage, the fortune, and every adult who mourned him. There is something in that fact that resists easy interpretation. It is not comforting exactly, but it is not nothing. Villa Turicum itself did not survive. After Edith's death, the palazzo on the bluff sat dormant for years, the terraced gardens untended, the elm-lined mall neglected, the 44 rooms emptied of everything except dust and the particular melancholy that settles over great houses when the families that built them can no longer sustain the cost of inhabiting them. Vandals came, as vandals always come to empty houses whose grandeur attracts both admiration and destruction. The weather came, working its slow, patient damage on stonework and plaster and the wooden frames of windows that no one was there to close. And in 1956, 24 years after Edith's death, 10 years before Fowler's, the house was raised. The 44 rooms, the formal mall, the Italianate palazzo that Charles Platt had designed to last centuries and that Edith had built to embody the permanence her family could not achieve in feeling, all of it was demolished, reduced to rubble, and cleared from the bluff where it had stood for less than 50 years. Portions of the gardens and terraces survived, restored by later owners who recognized something worth preserving in the landscape architecture even after the house that justified it was gone. The watercourse and the terraces and some fragments of the formal design still exist on that bluff above Lake Michigan, maintained now by people who have no connection to the McCormick or Rockefeller names and who tend. What remains because it is beautiful, not because it is meaningful. That is the right closing image for the dynasty, not total disappearance. That would be too clean, too final, too much like a lesson. Fragments, terraces without a house, gardens without a family, a zoo without the patron story, a medical institute without the child whose death inspired it, the physical remnants of an ambition that outlived the love, the marriage, the household, the money in its original form, and every person who ever stood on that bluff and looked out at the lake and believed that what they had built would last. What this family's story finally reveals is not that money fails in some abstract moral sense, not that wealth is a curse, or that the rich are punished for their excess, or that there is a cosmic price attached to the accumulation of too much. It is something colder, more specific, and more difficult to reduce to a lesson than any of those formulations would suggest. The money succeeded. It succeeded brilliantly and completely at doing exactly what it was designed to do: preserve, structure, allocate, protect the name, outlast the individual, keep disorder at bay through trustees and committees and carefully drafted legal instruments that could operate for decades after the people who wrote them were dead. What it could not do, what no system of trusts and no architecture of committees has ever been able to do, was teach the people inside it how to live ordinary emotional lives. The children of Edith and Harold McCormick inherited billions in prestige and millions in administered wealth, but the more lasting and more damaging inheritance was administrative love, care translated into institutions, grief translated into memorial funds, conflict translated into custody proceedings and trust language, family feeling translated into fractions, measured in twelfths, and contested in appellate courts. There is no neat moral to that. There is no lesson that wraps the damage in meaning and makes it bearable. There is just the image of a woman once surrounded by 44 rooms and formal gardens and elm-lined approaches dying in a hotel bedroom, with her children beside her too late and too thoroughly damaged to become a family again, and a will that ranked them below a man who was not blood, and a set of trusts that would go on processing them for decades after she was gone, and a house on a bluff above a lake that would stand empty for 24 years and then be torn down because nobody was left who could bear to live inside what it represented.